So this is something which we already know, that what is the process of systematic review. We already, Anju and myself, we have given you quite in detail kya karna hai usme, having a research question, etc. So we know that many times we know the review, but we don't really know how to interpret the results. So right now it is just the methodology of systematic review, that is formulate a focused question, conduct a systematic search, literature search, refine the search by applying predetermined inclusion and exclusion criteria, extract the appropriate data and assess their quality and validity, synthesize, interpret and report the data. So now in the reporting of systematic review, there are certain criteria which you all should have. Those who have done a systematic review, you can just check whether you had PRISMA or not in your systematic review. PRISMA is preferred reporting of meta-analysis. Basically in that you are giving how you searched, what was the initial search heading, how many articles you retrieved, how many were irrelevant or how many were related to your work, then how many you included, how many you excluded. So that kind of thing will come in the PRISMA. After that, after you have done a systematic review, then AIIMS is the analysis of meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and this is AIIMS is a system by which you can analyze the validity of the results of a systematic review. And after that, after you have a systematic review and you have checked these various checklists, then you have grade, which is a method of grading of recommendations, evaluation, development and evaluation. So this is what we are going to discuss, because they think that this is the most robust system which is present right now, and they are even modifying the grade at present. So very soon you may have a little more different, a little more evolved version, but the basic concept actually remains the same. So how do we define the quality of evidence? The quality of evidence reflects the extent to which confidence in an estimate of effect is adequate to support a particular recommendation. That means how much confidence will you have in a particular recommendation? So what grade it is. For example, if you have to incorporate a particular antibody for treatment of COVID, you would like to know what is the grade of evidence. If it is grade 1 or grade 1A or grade 1B, then you will think that yes, this is something which I should incorporate in the guidelines. But if it is something like evidence is C or grade 3, in that situation you will not be able to incorporate into your, because the faith that you have in that particular therapy is not enough. So this definition has two important implications. Firstly, the guideline panels must make judgments about the quality of evidence relative to the specific context in which they are using the evidence. And secondly, because systematic reviews do not, or at least should not make recommendation, they require a different definition. For example, systematic review itself gives you some recommendation, but it is not a guideline. After all, the next step is having a guideline in which you are incorporating the results of a systematic review. So, wait a minute. Okay, I'll just try with this one. Okay, so grade is the approach by which you classify the evidence, and grade is grading of recommendations, assessment, development and evaluations. It's a transparent framework for developing and presenting summaries of evidence, and it provides a systematic approach for making clinical practice recommendations. So clinical practice guidelines which are there, in that you incorporate. You must have read many guidelines where you find that it's written in the brackets, this was the grade of the evidence. So that is based on certain system which we are going to discuss. So it is the most widely adopted tool for grading the quality of evidence and making recommendations, and more than 100 organizations are currently following this system. So when we do analysis is rating quality of evidence and strength of recommendations, it is an emerging consensus. So this is actually just a reference. So failure to consider the quality of evidence can lead to misguided recommendations. And if the quality of evidence was low, for example, if there was a lot of heterogeneity in the data and you give this in your recommendations, then people will have kind of false belief in that particular recommendation. So it can lead to a serious error of judgment. High quality evidence, that is that an intervention is desirable, effects are clearly greater than an undesirable effects, or are clearly not warrants a strong recommendation. For example, if you have that desirable effects are more than the undesirable effects, that means there are more benefits than side effects, then of course it is a good recommendation. And in this we also get economic analysis sometimes, because if an intervention is very expensive, even that kind of adds to the side effect of the intervention. But uncertainty about the trade-offs because of low quality evidence or because of desirable and undesirable effects are closely balanced warrants a weak recommendation. So if we are not very sure whether this is beneficial or more harmful, for example, anyway, let's not talk about the vaccine, but people in the beginning had a lot of issues about the COVID vaccine, that it would have more side effects. So at that time people were wondering whether to go for it or not. So the guidelines should inform clinicians what the quality of the underlying evidence is and whether recommendations are strong or weak. And the grade approach provides a system for rating quality of evidence and strength of recommendations that is explicit, comprehensive, transparent, and pragmatic, and is increasingly being adopted by organizations. So let's have a look at a table from a Cochrane systematic review. So this is a table in which you have so this is actually summary of finding table is usually a very crowded one, so I'm not sure whether you all can read it, but what it actually shows is that this is from our systematic review, which was equivalent doses of intradermal fraction dose can be enlarged? Okay. No, but it won't fit into the whole thing, I think.
No. It will be like a lens and we can see that.
Yeah. So this is the इससे
Text on this slide.
करो
Portion on this one.
Okay. All right. So some things there. So on one side we have outcomes, and which is and the effect size which is there in the middle, and that is being shown as a relative effect over there, and then number of participants which have been included. So more the number of participants, more is the belief that the result may be true. More is the effect, that means more is the relative risk, then you may feel that the result is stronger. The wider are the confidence intervals, the lesser is the belief that that result is valid. So most of these things will be considered over here. And now we have to reduce the size. Yeah. So here, for example, this is the relative effect, this is number of participants, this is certainty of evidence, which will be on grade. For example, if you have an odds ratio of 0.30 and the dispersion is 0.22 to 0.41 and there are 6 RCTs, the conclusion here is that the evidence is of low quality. And similarly, we are having 17 RCTs here and a larger sample size of 4867. Then the conclusion is that this is actually a very low evidence of the category of B, C, and E. So you have to, by applying grade, we can come to conclusion that whether we have to believe something or we don't have to believe something. So the example is something like this. There are two main concepts when interpreting results and drawing conclusions. For example, this person says, I figure that there is a chance of there is a 40% chance of showers and a 10% chance that we know what we are talking about. So that means this 40% chance is not actually correct because your faith in that particular prediction is only about 10%. So you need to know how strong is the evidence and the method which actually has been used to give that evidence. So we have to have magnitude of effect on one side, which was 40%, but confidence in that effect and the quality of evidence was only 10%. So that is why you will grade this evidence as low. So the ratings can be on the basis of certainty. So the certainty is very low when the true effect is probably markedly different from the estimated effect. It is low when the true effect might be markedly different from the estimated effect. So here it was probably markedly and now it is markedly different. It will be moderate when the authors believe that the true effect is probably close to the estimated effect. And it is high when the authors have a lot of confidence that the true effect is similar to the estimated effect. So the estimated effect is on one side and the other side is the true effect. So if they are very close together, then we have a highest confidence and we call that evidence as the high degree on the grade.
Ma'am, is there any specific guideline? Because if they when please explain.
Yeah.
You are saying that probably markedly different. So is it a subjective decision or?
Yeah, in grade actually some of the things are subjective. And they are just being defined now very low, moderate, and it usually is low, moderate, and high. But very low becomes when you are absolutely not sure what is the difference in effect from, then you call it very low. When it is absolutely grey actually, that is the reason. So what are the reasons for rating up or down? Sometimes if there is certainty can be rated down for risk of bias. So if there is lot of risk of bias, in that case the certainty will be low. If there is lot of imprecision, then it is low. If there is inconsistency, which is equivalent to heterogeneity, then also the confidence is low. If there is indirectness means something which is not generalizable, something which is you are extrapolating from something. Then also, if indirectness is more, then again your confidence will be low. And if there is publication bias, then also the confidence will be low. But the certainty can be rated up if there is a large magnitude of effect, if there is a dose-response gradient. For example, if it is shown that you giving a particular drug in different doses and the effect is getting higher, something like what happens in biomarkers, then you are have more confidence in that. Then all residual confounding would decrease the magnitude of effect in situations with an effect. So if there are many confounding factors, then obviously you will have less magnitude, you will have less confidence. But if the confounding factors are taken care of, then your effect will be better. Now what is risk of bias? You've all, I think you've gone through that. The drawbacks or limitations in the design and execution of a trial may bias the treatment effect estimates. For example, in the methodology, if randomization has not been done according to the set criteria, if the blinding is inadequate, if there is high attrition rate, if the data which has been collected has some systematic error in it. So all these things will lead to bad quality of a clinical study or a clinical trial. and will have a higher risk of bias. And higher the risk of bias, lower will be the grade of that particular evidence. So the more serious are the limitations, the more likely it is that the quality of evidence will be downgraded. So you actually, after you have looked at the effects estimates in the meta-analysis, you can actually further downgrade it after you have put this into the grade software. So this is again how we interpret all these, the tool which is there. So this is like a table which actually gives you an idea about how we interpret these results to limit for limitations such as risk of bias tool in Cochrane reviews and the corresponding grade assessment. So if the risk of bias is low, so if it is across the studies, that means most information is from studies at a low risk of bias. If the risk of bias is low and the interpretation here is that plausible bias unlikely to seriously alter the results, that means the results will be quite reliable. As far as considerations are concerned, there are no limitations for these recommendations, and the grade assessment of this will be that there are no serious limitations, so we do not downgrade the quality of the evidence. But then there may be a risk of bias is unclear. You know those yellow dots which are there. What does it mean? It means that most information is from studies at low or unclear risk of bias. Interpretation is that the plausible bias that raises some doubts about the results. And the consideration here is that potential limitations are unlikely to lower the confidence in the estimate of effects, or they are likely to lower the confidence in the estimate of effect. And the high risk of bias means that the proportion of information from studies at high risk of bias is sufficient to affect the interpretation of results, and plausible bias that seriously weakens the confidence in the results, and crucial limitation for one criteria or some limitation for multiple criteria sufficient to lower the confidence in the estimate of effect. And another part of it would be that there is crucial limitation for one or more criteria sufficient to substantially lower the confidence, and this is a very serious limitation, and you will lower or downgrade by 2 levels. So they are generally represented as 4 plus or 3 plus when it is in the positive side, or they could be minus, or like 4 minuses or 3 minuses like this. Yeah.
If we have a very few, very little number of studies that could be included as a part of the systemic review, and we see that the risk of bias is high in most of them. So should we include those particular criteria on the basis of which they are saying that the bias
Yes,
is high?
you should still put these studies onto the grade software so that you get some, ultimately conclusion will be this, that there is high risk of bias and the quality of evidence is low. But it will be good to put it on the grade software because that gives it more objectivity. Many times you have this notion that this particular therapy has a very low quality evidence. But when you put it on grade, then it becomes more objective. That's it. So this is something which we have discussed before, and this is how you get all these dots, which are different studies. So should we count the dots? You know, the ultimate result which comes about the risk of bias is not by counting the dots. It is also, the weightage is also given to the study subjects, the number of subjects, and the other methodologies which are used in that. So if it is more than 50% yellow or red, means low confidence, that means 30% or 60%. Is more than 20% is allocation concealment, more than 60% is selective outcome reporting. So if we count the dots, then this is what we get. Right? So because more than 50% are yellow, so what does it mean? That you have low confidence. So low confidence, is it 30% or 60%? So, but that is not what we should be doing. What are we actually weighing? All are equal weight. Problem is penalize when you have more studies. Risk of bias of studies providing more weight to the analysis would be considered more. So if you have a study which is providing say 40% weight to the ultimate conclusion which has been there, as Dr. Anju had actually shown you the forest plot, in which he mentioned about the weight of the study. So if the weight of the study is more, but the problems in those studies are more, so that means the whole result is confounded. The whole result is affected because of that. So you will have to see the quality of the, the contribution of the study to the total weight of the evidence. Okay, now what is indirectness? So consider the extent to which you are uncertain about the applicability of the evidence to your relevant question. So you consider the PICO, which is population intervention comparison, but it is not about evidence is generalizable to other populations. So this uncertainty or indirectness is when you are uncertain about the applicability of that particular study in the to your population. So suppose what are the differences in population? Going into the PICO, like what could be the differences? So in population, the effect on overall quality of evidence will vary depending on how different the study populations are. As a result, quality may not decrease by one level or decrease by 2 levels in extreme cases. So it is basically we are addressing heterogeneity amongst the studies, and now the differences are in the populations. Then is differences in interventions. So intervention also sometimes the dose is different or sometimes the make is different. So generally when interventions that are indirectly related to the study are included in the systematic review, evidence quality will be decreased. So if the interventions are a bit different and maybe you are just trying to pool them but they are not exactly similar. So if the difference is much more, in those cases the quality will be less. There is the differences in outcome measures. The difference between desired and measured outcomes may relate to time frame also sometimes. The use of substitute or surrogate endpoints in place of the patient important outcomes of interest is also something which is important. And then we have indirect comparisons which occur when a comparison of intervention A versus intervention B is not available. But A was compared with C and B was compared with C. And then you're trying to compare A and B because C you think was a constant at that point. Such studies allow indirect comparisons of the magnitude of effect of A versus B. As a result of indirect comparison, this evidence is of lower quality than head-to-head comparison. That's why people say there was no head-to-head comparison of two interventions, and because that will be better quality evidence then. So then is inconsistency, which is unexplained heterogeneity of results. So there are 3 broad types. It could be clinical, methodological, and statistical. We discussed that earlier. If there are wide variations of point estimates across the studies, then we find that the direction of effect is not a criterion for inconsistency. Minimum or no overlap of confidence intervals, which suggests variation is more than what one would expect by chance alone. And statistical criteria include tests of heterogeneity which test the null hypothesis that all studies have the same underlying magnitude of effect, have a low p-value, indicating to reject the null hypothesis. So this is about heterogeneity, in which you have methodological and you have statistical criteria. Then is imprecision. So imprecision is considered when the sample size and the number of events. If the sample size is very large, then there is likelihood that the imprecision will be less. And if the number of events also are very large, then also the imprecision will be less. And so you assess according to the effect size and control event rate and optimal information size. So optimal information size is also very important, that for a particular question, you need to have a minimum number of subjects, which actually is the sample size calculation which is there. So optimal information size, if the total number of patients included in a systematic review is less than the number of patients generated by a conventional sample size calculation, for a single adequately powered trial, consider rating it down for imprecision. That means the total number of subjects which have come up in a systematic review, they are less compared if there was a large enough trial, say a multi-century trial, and for that particular sample size would have been there. But if the total sample size is coming less than that for that particular effect size, then you will downgrade according to the grade recommendation. So in imprecision, the width of the confidence intervals is important. So wide confidence intervals indicates uncertainty about the effect, and this includes null effect and appreciable benefit or harm which may arise. So addressing imprecision, the width of confidence intervals, wide confidence intervals indicate uncertainty, but how wide is too wide, that is also you have to see. So this includes null effect and appreciable benefit or harm. And the rule of the thumb here is that if risk ratio is less than 0.75 or if it is more than 1.25, then we say that there is a appreciable benefit or harm of a particular study. Then is the publication bias. We have already discussed this a little bit during our previous session. So publication bias is a systematic underestimation or an overestimation of the underlying beneficial or harmful effect due to the selective publication of studies. And confidence in the combined estimates of effect from a systematic review can be reduced when publication bias is suspected. So again, you will downgrade a study if there is a large amount of publication bias which is detected in that particular meta-analysis. So this is how we study publication bias. In this, the circles represent the point estimates of the trials and the pattern of distribution resembles an inverted funnel. And here the publication bias is less. But in B, publication bias is detected because the funnel plot down is the similar studies are not symmetrically distributed around either the point estimate dominated by the larger trials or the results of the larger trials themselves. So this means that publication bias is there. And as you know, you should have about 10 studies at least for estimating this publication bias. So what can raise the quality? Exactly opposite of what we have discussed. A large magnitude, very large upgrade 2 levels. That means if the risk ratio is more than 5 or a relative risk is less than 0.2. Large upgrade 1 level if the relative risk is 2 or less than 0.5. Everyone uses to do badly, but after treatment almost everyone does well. That is the kind of conclusion that comes out. And otherwise what can raise is dose-response relationship. For example, in childhood lymphoblastic leukemia, risk for CNS malignancies is 15 years after the cranial irradiation. If there is no irradiation, it is 1%. If there are 12 gyri, it is 1.6. If it is 18, then it is 3.3. So it is kind of dose related. So you may say that there is an actual relationship between the dose of radiation and development of second malignancies in these patients. Then effect of plausible residual confounding may be working to reduce the demonstrated effect, or it may increase the effect if no effect was observed. So residual confounding is something which is rest of the things. Now after you have applied all other parameters, you found that there are some confounding factors which may still be residing there. So if they may work both ways. They may work to increase the demonstrable effect or they may decrease the demonstrable effect. So this is about the theoretical part of grade. I think Dr. Anil is going to demonstrate. Dr. Ragini is going to demonstrate the grade software. So should we start now or we do it later?
We have to discuss the risk of bias assessment
First, okay.
Then summary of findings.
Okay, so we can hammer a little bit more about risk of bias and then we go to summary of findings.
So Dr. Vivek, he is scientist T at our center and he is going to talk about the risk of bias assessment.
So good afternoon. So my topic is risk of bias assessment. So What is bias? Bias is a systematic error and deviation in results. Bias may be of little importance or not worthy considering, or it can be substantial. Bias can lead to underestimation of effect or overestimation of effect. Significance of assessing bias in systematic review. Difference in risk of bias are related to variation in the results of studies included in systematic review. All results may be consistent among themselves, but all studies should be flawed due to bias. Source of bias. So, selection bias, performance bias, attrition bias, detection bias, and reporting bias are the sources of bias. So, what is selection bias? So, in systematic difference in baseline characteristics between two groups. In example, selection of participants with differential age characteristics could be a selection bias. Performance bias. Systematic difference in attention and treatment other than intervention between two groups. Example is participants who are aware that they are not receiving any treatment may seek other forms of care. Attrition bias. Systematic difference in loss to follow-up between two groups is attrition bias. Detection bias. Systematic difference in between two groups in how outcomes are determined. Example is if the researcher is aware of intervention, the outcome might be assessed with bias. Reporting bias. So systematic differences between reported and unreported findings. Example is only publishing favorable outcomes, leaving readers with incomplete and skewed understanding of the results. So these are the domains of assessing risk of bias: random sequence generation, allocation concealment, blending of participants and personnel, blending of outcome assessment, incomplete outcome data, selective outcome reporting, and other sources of bias. So these are the overview of various domains for assessing risk of bias. So from target population to we allocate them in intervention or control group, then we assess the outcome, and then publication by study outcomes. So how to assess risk of bias? By reviewing author's judgment in article, searching for clues to bias, looking for missing information in reviewing study protocol, or contacting authors. So into intervention and control groups. Avoid selection bias and confounders, both known and unknown. What is fundamental question behind this? What was the allocation sequence adequately generated? What are the methods used to generate allocation sequence? So how to judge the random sequence generation? So if there is referring to a random number table using computer random number generator, coin tossing, shuffling cards or envelopes, or throwing dice, there is a low risk of bias. If sequence generated by odd or even date of birth, day of visit, allocation by judgment of clinician, participant, allocation based on results of laboratory test, there is a high risk of bias. This information you will find in RCT paper in methodology sections. Next is allocation concealment. Concealing allocation sequence from those assigning participants to intervention groups until the moment of assignment ensures that patients enroll into a study without knowing which group they will be assigned to. If the researcher knows the next patient will be allocated to intervention, he or she may try to help a certain patient whom he thinks will benefit more from intervention. So what is fundamental question behind allocation concealment? Was the allocation adequately concealed? What methods are used to conceal the allocation sequence? Could intervention allocations have been foreseen in advance or during enrollment? So how to judge the allocation concealment? If central allocation including telephone, web-based and pharmacy controlled randomization is done, there is a low risk of bias. Sequentially numbered drug containers of identical appearance and sequentially numbered opaque and sealed envelopes were used, there is a low risk of bias. If open random allocation scheduled list of random numbers, unsealed non-opaque envelopes were used, data of birth, case record numbers were used, so there could be a high risk of bias. So next is blinding of participants and personnel. So masking of participants and assessor from knowledge about which intervention was received. ensures control group receive similar amount of attention, ancillary treatment and investigations, avoids performance and detection bias. So what is fundamental question behind blinding of participants and personnel? Was knowledge of the allocated intervention adequately prevented during the study? What measures were used for blinding? Is it likely that blinding was broken? So if no blinding or incomplete blinding but outcome unlikely to be influenced, so there is a low risk of bias. Blinding done and unlikely that the blinding could have been broken, and no blinding but outcome assessment blinded and non-blinded, unlikely to introduce bias. So this could be a introduced low risk of bias. If no blinding or incomplete blinding and outcome likely to be influenced and blinding done but likely that the blinding could have been broken, so there could be a high risk of bias. So incomplete outcome data, unavailability of complete outcome data for review, attrition and exclusions, it will come. So in attrition, loss of follow-up or withdrawals. In exclusions, available data not included in analysis and report. It can lead to attrition bias. High proportion of missing outcomes or a large difference in proportions between two groups is the main cause of concern over bias. So fundamental question is, how much data is missing from each group? Why is it missing? And how were they analyzed? And were incompletely outcome data adequately addressed? So judgment. If no missing outcome data are reported and reasons for missing data not related to outcome, so there could be a low risk of bias. Missing data balanced across groups and reasons are similar. Next is proportion of missing outcomes not enough to have a clinically relevant effect. Next, plausible effect size, difference in mean or standardized difference in means not enough to have a clinically relevant effect. So this could be a low risk of bias if these were mentioned. So if reasons for missing data related to outcome, imbalance in numbers or reasons for missing data across groups were mentioned, proportion of missing outcomes enough to have a clinically relevant effect, and plausible effect size enough to have clinically relevant effects, so there could be a high risk of bias. Next is selective outcome reporting. So statistically significant results more likely to be reported as planned and in detail. So it can lead to reporting bias. So it is difficult to assess if, and the possible ways are comparing measured to results to look for outcomes measured are likely to be measured but not reported. Outcomes added, statistically changed, subgroups only, reporting that cannot be used in a review. Next, referring to study protocol or trial registers. In this fundamental question is, are reports of the study free for suggestion of selective outcomes reporting? So how to judge the selective outcome reporting? So if protocol is available and all pre-specified outcomes of interest to the review are reported in the pre-specified way, and protocol not available but it is clear that all pre-specified and expected outcomes of interest are reported, so there could be a low risk of bias. So if primary outcomes have not been reported as pre-specified or expected, so there could be a high risk of bias. If outcomes are reported incompletely so that they cannot be entered in a meta-analysis, it can lead to a high risk of bias. So other threats to validity are bias due to other problems not covered elsewhere above, as previously mentioned. So what is the fundamental question behind other threats to validity? Was the study prone to problems that put it at a high risk of bias? So how to judge the threats to validity? So if the study appears to be free of other sources of bias, so there could be a low risk of bias. If study has a potential source of bias related to the specific design used, had extreme baseline imbalance and claimed to have been fraudulent, so this causes high risk of bias. So what are the tools for assessment? So risk of bias table, Raymond we use. So it categorizes each domains into low risk, high risk and unclear. It supports for judgment direct quotes from article and additional outcomes with rational, or one for each study reviewed. So this is the table of risk of bias which is already discussed. And this is the risk of bias summary output of Raymond, and this is the risk of bias graph. It is also generated by Raymond. So grade criteria. In the grade system, the evidence is therefore initially set to either high or low. So there are then 5 criteria that can be used to downgrade 1, 2, or in case of indirectness, sometimes 3 steps. So these are risk of bias in individual studies. It can be a methodological issues in included studies such as inadequate blinding, inconsistency of results between studies, indirectness of evidence. Example is participants were children, although the systematic review was about adults. Next is imprecision. So results were not statistically significant or the effect was clinically important once the studies were meta-analyzed. Next is publication bias. If results was biased due to file drawing effect, as the study not showing a statistically significant effect or less likely to be published. So this is a summary of grade for systematic review. So the quality of evidence grades into high, moderate, low and very low. So this is already discussed by ma'am. So in high, we are very confident that the true effect lies close to that of the estimate of the effect. So high grade. So if we are moderately confident in the effect estimates, the true effect is likely to be close to the estimate of the effect, but there is a possibility that it is substantially different. So there is a moderate evidence. So our confidence in the effect estimate is limited. The true effect may be substantially different from the estimate of the effect. So there is low evidence. So if we have very little confidence in the effect estimate, the true effect is likely to be substantially different from the estimate of effect. So very low evidence. So these are the factors that can reduce the quality of the evidence. So if factor limitations in study design or execution, so it can consequences of this, what it can downgrade the 1 or 2 level. Inconsistency of results, indirectness of evidence, imprecision or publication bias can downgrade the evidence. Next is factors that can increase the quality of evidence. If large magnitude of effect is present, all plausible confounding would reduce the demonstrated effect or increase the effect if no effect was observed. In dose response gradient, it can increase the 1 or 2 level of evidence. So conclusion, bias can lead to overestimation or underestimation of results. Bias can be assessed for 7 domains. Judgments should be used for assessing risk by searching for clues, reviewing author's discussion. Caution should be applied in judgments. So these are the references I have used in my slides. So thank you. If there is a question, please.
So we have a scheduled tea break, but if you suggest, we can continue with the lectures, whatever. You want a tea break? Okay. So, okay, then we take a 10-minute short tea break and we'll join back. They want to have tea. entered PGI, and I'll be talking about summary of finding table. So we have been talking about systematic reviews since morning, and is it echoing? So we have been talking about systematic review since morning, and they are at the top of the hierarchy of evidence. Why? Because they give you highest level of evidence, and they are used further by the policymakers, and they are used to frame the guidelines regarding a treatment, for example. So they are the best form of evidence which is required by a clinician perspective, you say, or a researcher. So, for example, we have so many n number of publications are there. It's not possible to read, say, 100 or thousands of papers. So we have systematic review. You read a systematic review, and okay, so many n number of papers they are covered. But that systematic review should be reproducible, should be of high quality. Only then the evidence would be trustworthy, right? So when can we have the confidence in the finding of systematic review? There are 4 factors. Number one is the adequacy of data. The data should be adequate. We should refer to a sufficient number of studies, and those studies should be uniform enough. They should be homogeneous. All of them, they should be addressing a similar well-formulated research question, and then there should be homogeneity in the kind of data that each paper is reporting. And if there are minimal or no methodological limitations, then only we could have confidence in the finding of a systematic review. Relevance is another important point. It should be relevant in the current setting or related to a clinical perspective. Coherence among the studies. The data should be coherent. So based on all these factors, we could have no or very minor concerns regarding these issues, and then they are unlikely to reduce the confidence in the review findings. If there are minor concerns regarding these issues, they would reduce the confidence in the review findings. If there are moderate concerns regarding these 4 factors, they will probably reduce the confidence in the review findings. And if there are serious concerns regarding these factors, they are very likely to reduce the confidence in the findings of a systematic review. So it's very important to consider all these 4 factors. So for that, we have a system called GRADE. Ma'am has already talked about GRADE. GRADE is the grading of recommendation, assessment, development, and evaluation. It's a system. It's a system for developing and presenting summaries of evidence, and it provides a systematic approach for making clinical practice recommendations. So when you are assessing the quality of studies, and when you have certainty in the findings of a study, they are 2 different concepts. So quality mainly refers to the risk of bias assessment, whereas certainty refers to the results of a grade assessment, right? So you could make out whether we are talking about quality or certainty. Now we are talking about the certainty of the evidence. Quality refers to the quality of studies that are being incorporated in a systematic review. So this system was developed and updated by the GRADE working group. They are based in Canada, and it expresses the degree of confidence one can place in the quality of evidence and strength of recommendation. It is very important to assess the findings of a review using this GRADE criteria. Nowadays it is like mandatory to do the GRADE assessment. Okay, so it's a system for assessing the quality of evidence of a body of evidence based on the study design and the criteria for downgrading and upgrading, which ma'am has already talked about. So based on these criteria, the certainty of evidence could be high, moderate, low, or very low. So basically we are assessing a few things. We are assessing quality of the included studies. We are looking at the sample size, the weight of the studies, what is the variation among the studies, the heterogeneity. So based on all these factors and how many studies you have included in your systematic review, you reach to a conclusion whether we could have confidence in the findings of a systematic review or not, whether this systematic review could be used further for some policy making or to frame some guidelines. So it's very important that way. So we have already talked about the grade approach, the how to rate the quality of evidence using risk of bias assessment. Now I'll be talking about the summary of finding table. What does it mean? When you are using the grade software to assess your quality using when you're using the grade software and you are getting the results of a grade assessment, the results, they are expressed in the form of summary of finding table. It is presented in the form of a table which is called the summary of finding table. So grade is mandatory nowadays. You need to do the grade for a systematic review, but it is not mandatory to include a summary of finding table in your systematic review. However, the reviewers, they are strongly encouraged to include a summary of finding table. So even if you are not including a summary of finding table in a review, you need to give a valid explanation of why you are not giving your results in the form of a table, because in any case you are going to give your results in the form of a summary in the text of a systematic review. So it's better to give results as a supplementary information in the form of a table. Okay, so a summary of finding table provides a summary of the main findings of a review together with an assessment of quality or certainty of evidence, which are assessed using the grade tool upon which these results are based. So you use the grade software or the grade tool to reach to the findings of a grade assessment, and then it gives you results in the form of a table which is called the summary of finding table. Right? So far? Most importantly, Cochrane has adopted the grade approach for assessing the certainty of a body of evidence. So if you're doing a Cochrane review, it is absolutely compulsory to use the grade approach and to give the results in the form of SOF table. So this table includes a row for each important outcome, and up to a maximum of 7 outcomes could be included. And the accepted formats of summary of finding tables and interactive tables can be produced using the grade software. Again, a busy slide, but let's go let's look at each of the part one by one. So on top, this is how a summary of finding table looks like after doing your grade assessment using the grade software. So we're going to give you little bit idea about the grade software in the subsequent lecture. So when you get the results, they are in the form of a table. So what do you have at the top? You have a title of the systematic review. For example, in this case, I'm showing you probiotics compared to no probiotics as an adjunct to... It's not clear? Okay, so on top we have the title of the review, probiotics compared to no probiotics as an adjunct to antibiotics in children. Then you have the PICO. The patient population in this case is going to be children who are given antibiotics. Then the settings, inpatients and outpatient. And what is the intervention going to be? Probiotics. Comparison is going to be with no probiotics or placebo. And then you have the results for a particular outcome. For example, the first outcome is the incidence of diarrhea. So you will have results for this particular outcome. Okay. So you have categorized your children below the age of 5 years and above the age of 5 years. So in the first column you have the outcome, the number of participants, and in the second column you have the results in the form of relative effects. In this case we have the risk ratio. So for this particular outcome in children who are less than 5 years, we have the RR 0.41, and children's above 5 years we have the RR I'm sorry, 0.81. Then you also have the percentage of children who were given antibiotics, probiotics, and the children who were not given the probiotics. And then in the next column you have the difference, right? So these are the results of a particular outcome that you get mostly from even from your RevMan also you get. Okay, so when you are using the grade software, what additional information you get? You get the certainty of the evidence based on all those factors that ma'am has discussed: indirectness, inconsistency, and so on. So on the basis of that, you have the certainty of evidence marked as moderate for this particular outcome. So you have additional section for comments, which means you can interpret the results as probiotics probably decrease the incidence of diarrhea because the certainty of the evidence in this case was moderate, not high. If it would have been high, then you could have certainly say, okay, probiotics are definitely decreasing the incidence of diarrhea in children, right? So this is the additional information we get using the grade software. So we can have different rows for different outcomes, like first outcome was the incidence of diarrhea, then you have for the adverse events. So each row represents the outcome and each column represents, first three column represents the results of the study, and the last two column represent the results of grade assessment, right? Okay.
It's available in both RevMan and COVID in this set.
RevMan, no. You need to use the Grade software, Grade Pro software. I think it's freely available, so you can just input the results. You can just input the RevMan file directly, and it will assess the. It will give you the results as well as the grade assessment. Okay.
But COVID is?
Mm-hmm.
How do you make the summary of finding table?
The software will automatically make the table for you.
If you don't have the software, is there any way to make it?
No. Manually you should not. It's not advisable. So that's the whole point of doing the grade. Na? If you're not using the grade, then you cannot quote grade na, in your paper. So you need to use this software and then only you'll get the results. Okay, let's see the results one by one. So first of all, you choose one main comparison from the review for the main summary of finding table. You can choose up to 7 outcomes to include in the summary of finding table. So these first 2 steps, they should be done at the protocol stage. When you are writing the protocol, then only you should decide about the main comparisons or the outcomes. Then you assess the quality of evidence for each outcome using risk of bias and other factors. Then you present the effects or impact of the intervention, whether they are relative or absolute, in the form of table. So, in the first step, you choose one comparison which you want to include in the summary of finding table. Only one comparison should be included in each summary of finding table, and this step, as I've already told, should be completed at the protocol stage. For example, you have one question: interventions which are aimed at communities to inform or educate about early childhood vaccination. So in this case, you have just main one comparison, that is interventions. What are the interventions which are aimed at communities to inform or educate about early childhood vaccination versus routine immunization practices in primary and community care? Intervention in this case would be interventions to inform or educate the members of the community about early childhood vaccination, and comparator here is the routine immunization practice. So this is all about one comparison. But what if there are several comparisons in the review? It is possible that you have more than one comparison. So you need to make a separate summary of finding table for each comparison. Outcomes could be many, but for each comparison you need to have different number of summary of finding tables. Okay. So which comparison you would choose? You would choose the comparison which is most relevant to the decision makers to be included in the main summary of finding table at the start of review. Identify any other comparisons that are important to decision makers to be included as additional summary of finding tables. So fill in the table title, okay, which should describe the main comparison the table will present, the population, intervention, comparison, and setting fields in the table, right? So repeat this step for each additional summary of finding table in this format. So your first part is complete when you feed this information. Okay. Then step 2, I've already said that you can choose up to 7 important outcomes to be included in the summary, one summary of finding table. So create a list of all relevant outcomes which you want to consider, including all possible outcomes that might be important in the review. There could be like more than one outcome. One is the primary outcome and the other ones are the secondary. Like in the table I showed you earlier, the primary outcome was the incidence of diarrhea, and secondary outcomes were like adverse events or episodes of vomiting, etc. Okay. So you can also create a list for any other outcomes for which data was not reported but which might be important for decision maker about the intervention, such as adverse events, okay, or costing. Choose which outcomes are to be included in the summary of finding table. At least 2 authors must reach agreement. Here also we need more than one reviewer. It should be done by 2 authors, and in case if there is any disagreement, a third author should be consulted. Now coming to the step 3. For each outcome, assess the quality of evidence. Grade the quality of the evidence for each outcome. Here also you need minimum of 2 review authors who should work independently to assess the quality of evidence and resolve any disagreement. So these are the domains which we assess for the quality of evidence. Number 1 is study design, whether it is RCT or a non-RCT. You know that randomized control trials, they are of the highest quality as compared to any other kind of study like observational cohort or case control. Then risk of bias. You assess the risk of bias for all the domains which Vivek has already discussed. So based on that, you will say whether there are no effects, any serious concern or very serious concern, right? Then you will also assess inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, publication bias, or any other factors. So based on downgrading them by 2 factors or say 1 factors or upgrading them, you will reach at the conclusion of whether the quality of the evidence is high 4+, moderate 3+, low 2+, and very low single+, right? And then you could also give explanation, the reasons why you have downgraded or upgraded a particular domain. You can give explanation so that the readers, they know why you have taken such a decision in this regard. Okay. So once you have decided on the level of evidence, fill in the quality of evidence column in the summary of finding table. Step 1 was feeding the systematic review details, the title. Step 2 is feeding the data on the quality of evidence, right? So you must keep track of why you have downgraded or upgraded the evidence and provide footnotes explaining this in the table. This is a critical part of the summary of finding table, so that the readers, they understand why you have taken any decision about a particular factor. Okay. So this is another table where you have a number of studies, different columns are there. Let's see the column one by one. In the first column, we have one particular outcome, which is pain, and it has included 5 randomized control. Then what are the limitations? There is no serious limitation, number one. Then inconsistency, no serious inconsistency. Indirectness, no serious indirectness. No imprecision. Publication bias was not detected. And this is the data. This is the data in placebo. You have 241 events out of a total number of events on antibiotics, and the relative risk calculated by the Revman software, and also the absolute risk. So the quality of evidence through grade came out to be high for this particular outcome, right? And then you have the data for different outcomes, high, moderate, or so on, right? So in the step 4, present the effects of the intervention in the form of whether you have your data as dichotomous or continuous. If the data is dichotomous, the results, they are presented as a relative risk or odds ratio along with 95% confidence interval. And if you have continuous data, then the results, they are expressed as either mean or median. So depending on the data, the Revman or the software will calculate the results, whether it has to be in the form of relative or absolute values. Okay, so when using Grade Pro, all of this information will be imported automatically from your either your Excel sheet or the Revman. The only thing that you want to take the decision is regarding all that 7 domains. That is literally subjective because you are taking the decision. So it's always advisable you have 2 independent reviewers. So you decide the data, whether it is quantitative or narrative, and for each outcome the data is presented. So how to decide on, these are the standard statements to describe the results. When the quality of evidence is high, so it means there is improvement in the benefit, right? And if it is less important benefit or harm, then it says improve slightly. If there is no important benefit, that means little or no difference. But we are confident in the results. Whether it is positive or negative, we are confident about the results. If you have moderate quality of evidence, that you will use the term probably. If it is an important benefit, you will say probably improve. If it is a less important benefit, you will say probably improve slightly. If there is no important benefit, you will say probably little or no difference in that term. If it is low, then you will use the term may. It may improve slightly, or it may have little or no difference. And if it is very low, then we are uncertain whether the intervention would improve the outcome. In that case, you should not take your systematic review further. It's not advisable. Sometimes you don't have any events or rare events, so it's not required if you don't have any studies or you don't have any comments. So these four rows are important when you have to comment about high, moderate, low, or very low evidence. Right? It's clear? So to summarize, what are the major elements of a system summary of finding table as per the standard Cochrane format? Number 1 is a brief description of the population and setting, a brief description of the comparison, a list of the most critical or most important health outcome, a measure of the typical burden of each outcome, the absolute and the relative magnitude of effect, the number of participants and studies, a grade assessment of the overall certainty. It has a space for comments and explanations. Right? It's clear, or if it's not clear, you may ask the question now. I think it was simple, right? That's it? Okay, it's again a repetition. It's clear to you. Okay, some important points. As a journal guidance, enter the information for readers directly into the table. Generally, do not cite references in the explanation section. You don't need to give references unless there are specific reasons. For example, you are providing information about sources of baseline risk. Otherwise, it's not as advisable to cite the references. Provide the source of information about the baseline risks which are used to calculate the absolute effects. What is the base on which the findings are based. So on completion of the table, review all the explanation to determine if some could be referenced multiple times, if reworded or combined. Provide reasons for upgrading and downgrading the evidence. It's very important. The body of evidence for a particular outcome may be determined to have serious or very serious issues for the affected domain. So it may be useful to indicate the number of levels for downgrading or upgrading. Although explanations about the certainty in the evidence, they are primarily required when they alter the certainty, consider adding an explanation when the certainty in the evidence has not been altered. Ensure that the table is not used as a description of the methods of the review. Enter the results for outcomes that could not be combined statistically in a meta-analysis directly into the SOF table. An explanation may not be necessary in this case. So that's it. Thank you. So the next talk is by Dr. Ragini Bhatia. She is a scientist C at our center, and she is going to talk about the grade software.
Good evening, everybody. Now we have already discussed a lot about grade. Now I'll just do some hands-on exercise for grade software. So PPTs में चलो फिर मैं ऑनलाइन सॉफ्टवेयर बता देती हूँ. ठीक है, एक स्लाइड बताना.
चलो बता.
नहीं वो मैम नहीं विवेक को इसमें डाल has already discussed, so I'll just now the Grade Pro Guideline Development Tool. The Grade Pro Guideline Development Tool is the software used to create summary of findings tables in Cochrane systematic reviews. Grade Pro GDT is an easy-to-use, all-in-one web solution to summarize and present information for healthcare decision-making. to import results of statistical analysis from RevMan and export a summary of findings table into RevMan file.
Do we have to download it?
No, ma'am. It's available online.
अच्छा online
After user service.
This is the website for Grade Pro software. Here you have to log in. I've already made a account. So this is how it will open up when you will put in the password and log in into the Grade Pro software. So here let me first give you an example of some intervention. Suppose we have already done a systematic review and meta-analysis on a research question, that is whether herbal products are beneficial than the chlorhexidine mouthwash that we use for good oral health. Suppose this is our research question. Herbal products can be different like trifla, amla, or neem leaves, anything. So this is our intervention, and our control is chlorhexidine mouthwash. So our outcomes are S mutans count. S mutans is a bacteria in the mouth. If it increases, that means the oral health is deteriorating. So that is one outcome. A second outcome is a plaque index. So is the plaque is formed more or less after the intervention? Intervention is our herbal products. Third outcome, let's say gingival index. So in this we have to see the quality of the you can say saliva that is in our mouth. So these are the outcomes that we have. So let's see how we'll make a summary of findings table in this software. So we'll say new project. We can name it herbal products versus chlorhexidine, CHX. We'll create project. Now it will. Now here we will add management question. Here we'll put our intervention, herbal product. Then we'll compare it to, our comparison is control CHX, chlorhexidine. Be used for good oral health. Setting is India. So we'll save it. From here we'll save it. This is our research question. Now we'll click on this question again, and here this table will come up. Now here we have to change the format. From here we'll click on grade evidence profile like this, and here we'll see some table like this in which we have all the certainty assessment, study design, risk of bias, inconsistency. So we'll start filling it. We'll do add outcome. So we'll name our outcome. First outcome is S mutants. S mutants count. So we'll write here S mutants. Then length of follow-up. We'll not add this right now. Here it's 2 weeks. We'll be looking at 2 weeks.
Where do we get this table from?
I just mentioned, now if I'll go back, it will go
Because we are unable to find that icon. Which icon has
okay. Extreme right. Extreme right, this one, here. This box like thing, you can click there, and then you grade profile. grade evidence profile. You click on that. Now here comes the name of our outcome, S mutants. Here we'll put the number of studies. For this outcome, suppose we had 3 studies. We'll apply, then study design. We had taken only RCTs for this systematic review, so RCTs. Risk of bias is not serious. We have already seen and done this. So now we'll just add here. Not serious, indirectness. Suppose we are confused whether it is not serious or serious, we can do it here also, assess directness. Here it will ask some questions that is the evidence sufficiently direct, then we can add here yes, probably yes, like this we can then apply it. But since we didn't fill it fully, so I'll say not serious. Imprecision was also not serious. Other considerations. In case you have to edit something, you can go to the right. Now this is a continuous data and pooled evidence because we have done meta-analysis. We have already done meta-analysis. And then we'll save it. Suppose there were 150 participants in this. In our intervention, there were 150 participants. In chlorhexidines also, we took 150 participants. We'll apply. I think I'll be taking up. Weeks. It is a continuous. It is pooled. Number of studies 4. It is a randomized control trial. Publication bias we have to add here. No. Here it is the standard mean difference of, suppose it is 3.5 from, let's say, 3.0 to 4.0. This is our confidence interval. So here we have added one outcome manually. This basically will see our meta-analysis results and then we'll add those results here. Now, if we want to now make it in a table form, for our publication we need the table, so we'll export it. First, we'll change the settings from here to summary of finding table. Then we'll export it in the PDF form. In the portrait form, and here we'll download it. So it will look like this, like ma'am was telling about this table. So this we can give for publication. Here we can see the certainty of evidence is high, and we can add comments also, number of participants it has given. So finally it will look like this. We can add more outcomes in this. Now I'll tell you how to import data from RevMan. Now here we'll click on import outcomes. So it will say choose RevMan or grade file. Is it there? We have not well. So I'll import it from here. Choose RevMan file. Here it is. So I've already made a file. I'll do next. I'll see which outcome do I need. Suppose plaque index, I'm choosing this file. So I'll put import outcome, and here it has imported all the results. So it is this one. I'll give the name plaque index. Plaque index. Then again this follow-up was done for 2 weeks. I'll correct it here, 2 weeks. That's it. I'll apply. Here now it is showing plaque index. Now I'll add outcome. Now in this I have to change the format. So I'll go here on this box and grade evidence profile. Now it will be showing like this. So here it has picked up the number of studies, it has picked up the number of patients and the results. So now I'll add the quality. So number of studies, suppose they were, it has all, study design was RCT. So again I'll fill the evidence of certainty here. If I click certainty, if I click serious, then I'll have to add explanation. Suppose here I'll click and I'll add an explanation that the studies had heterogeneity. This comment I'll add and I'll save it. So here comes serious and raised to power A. So A is the comment that will show up later on. Then again serious. I can explain it later also. Or I can say not serious. Here also not serious. Not serious. Publication bias undetected. Here it has already. Now I'll export it also. For exporting, I'll change the format. Summary of findings table. And then on this arrow, I'll click. And then it has not picked up that file. Want it? There are other formats also for the table. Like this format, it has given in detail. Here, number of participants, the studies, everything is in detail. I can export this also. I'll say select all. Here PDF, download. So here is our table of all the outcomes, and here below, here is the comment that we added. A, the studies had heterogeneity. So this is how we form the tables. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your patience and be active till the last of this workshop. I now request ma'am to please say the final concluding words and conclude this workshop.
So thank you everybody for being here, and I hope you benefited from this workshop. The first part, of course, was how to conduct a systematic review, and the second part was what else you can do to the systematic review which has been conducted, and you can actually critically appraise it and also apply grade evidence to that to grade the quality of the evidence which has been generated. So the baseline data which is required for grade software, as you know, is the systematic review. And from that systematic review, what are the trials, how many subjects are there, what is the effect size, and whether there is any heterogeneity which is present. So all that would have to be listed in this software. This is actually available for free for institutions, those who are doing systematic reviews. Now they've started asking questions, how many systematic reviews you are doing, then they give a free access to this particular software. But you kind of understand everything only when you are actually practically working on the data. It's very difficult to follow, if somebody has done it, but of course she has shown it to you, how it is done and how you ultimately can get a summary of finding table in a PDF format. And that can be then exported to your systematic review, and which is now having a grade of evidence, and that can be then incorporated if the evidence is high into the guidelines, or you can wait for more studies or more results whenever there is a review like that. So basically you can give us feedback as to what kind of sessions you would like to have in future. But those of you who have written the questions, I would suggest that all of you conduct searches on them, build up a search strategy, build up a team actually first, and then build a search strategy. And you can take help from Pranita, who's in the Center for Evidence-Based Child Health in PGI. She can help you build up that strategy. And we have our own librarian also. He can also help you with that. So in future then we will try to conduct some more courses with our own resources. Now that all of you, those who've written their questions, will come back with some protocols, we hope. And we can conduct a protocol writing workshop and then completion of the systematic review workshop also. So, but it's only after the systematic review has been done that you need a grade. But grade also becomes a part of the systematic review once you want to actually classify the evidence about its how superior it is in comparison to the previous grades or whatever is available now. So those of you who've done systematic reviews, you can actually run some of your searches again and then see if the conclusions have changed over the previous times, because systematic review is such a thing that that process never ends. Actually, it is that, as they say, the life of systematic reviewer is full of trials. So you have to go on having supplementing the trials, and that is how update software was built up and Cochrane Library, because that needs to be reviewed all the time. After at least every 2 years, a Cochrane review has to be updated, and other reviews which are non-Cochrane or if published in other journals, they also will need, to be updated after new evidence has accumulated. So with that, we come to an end to this particular session, and I would really like to thank my colleagues from PGI Chandigarh, my young colleagues from PGI Chandigarh, who have always been helping us. Vivek, Anil, Pranita, and Ragini, and of course Meenakshi, who have been conducting systematic reviews and making summaries of evidence and even advising policy sometimes. And there are a young lot of individuals who are doing a lot of work in this particular field. But we as physicians can also get into this particular field, and these days with the Niti Aayog giving a lot of opportunities for research in this particular field, and even Directorate of Health Research is also providing health technology assessments. We all can participate in these activities and become very active members in that. And I particularly want to thank Dr. Anju Sinha. She is actually a torchbearer for evidence-based medicine in ICMR, and we have been working together now for the last 10 years or so. And I would actually like to honor you, Anju, for we just had something coming from Badrinath. So,
so nice. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was my real pleasure to be here in AIIMS Rishikesh. Thoroughly impressed by your infrastructure, your library, and I also requested for access to your library because there are many things which we can also, access and use it. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm sure this may have, added to your acumen in the field of systematic reviews. Most of you are already well aware about it and already doing it. So wish you all the best in your future endeavors.
thank you very much.